The palace called it a routine administrative adjustment. But behind closed doors, courtiers were using very different words: an emergency order, a rushed consultation, a signature obtained under extraordinary circumstances. Within hours, whispers spread through royal corridors that King Charles had taken a step few believed possible, one that directly affected Queen Camilla and the last royal distinction still tying her influence to the heart of the monarchy. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the first signs of trouble began when senior aides were quietly summoned for a private discussion that was never placed on the normal household schedule. No grand announcement was prepared. No public explanation was offered. Yet inside palace circles, the mood was said to be tense, almost frozen, as if everyone present understood they were dealing with something far bigger than a simple paperwork change. Insiders whispered that an emergency directive had been reviewed, one connected to royal privilege, rank, and the delicate question of how much authority Camilla should continue to hold as the monarchy entered a more fragile chapter. What made the moment even more explosive was the reported absence of Camilla herself from the most sensitive parts of the discussion. That silence opened the door to darker speculation. Why was she not at the center of a decision that concerned her own position? Why were communications aides allegedly told to hold back, even as media outlets began sensing movement behind the curtain? The palace, usually careful to control every word, gave nothing away, and that silence only made the story burn hotter. For the public, it looked like mystery. For royal watchers, it looked like pressure. But for those who had followed the slow tension building around Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, and the future of the crown, it felt like the first crack in a wall that had been under strain for years. The emergency order was not just about a title. It was about power, legacy, loyalty, and the terrifying possibility that the king had finally decided the institution must come before personal comfort. But if this decision appeared sudden, the truth is that its roots stretched back through years of private disagreements, hidden frustrations, and a battle for influence that had been quietly intensifying behind palace walls. Long before the emergency order was signed, there were signs that something inside the royal household was shifting. Small moments, quiet exclusions, decisions that seemed insignificant at the time but now appear to form a pattern. The closer observers looked, the more they realized this wasn't a single event, it was the culmination of a struggle that had been unfolding for years. Camilla's rise had once seemed like the ultimate royal comeback, a woman who moved from controversy to acceptance, from the shadows of public anger to the center of royal ceremony. When Charles became king, her place beside him appeared secure, wrapped in titles, duties, and the quiet power that comes from proximity to the throne. But reports suggest that as her responsibilities grew, so did the unease around her influence. Some inside the palace believed the monarchy needed discipline, restraint, and a sharper focus on public trust. Others seemed more comfortable with personal loyalty, private circles, and the softer politics of household control. That difference slowly created a fault line. Traditionalists worried that the crown was being pulled too close to family preference, while modernizers argued the institution had to adapt or risk looking frozen in the past. Yet beneath those polite arguments was something far more dangerous: the question of legacy. Who would shape the monarchy after Charles? Who would protect its image while he carried the weight of age, illness, and public pressure? As William and Catherine's role grew stronger, and as senior working royals became more central to the future plan, Camilla's position began to look less untouchable than it once had. Courtiers reportedly noticed subtle changes: fewer informal channels, tighter control over briefings, and a growing sense that palace factions were no longer hidden as carefully as before. What had once been quiet disagreement was turning into an internal test of power. Camilla had survived public storms before, but this was different. This pressure was not coming from outside critics alone. It was rising from within the walls of the monarchy itself, from people who believed the crown could not afford confusion at the top. And as those concerns deepened, the emergency order began to look less like a shocking break and more like the final move in a long, silent struggle. Yet the real turning point didn't come from public criticism, It came from a private incident that reportedly left senior royals questioning whether certain boundaries had been crossed. Those familiar with palace operations describe a moment that altered the entire conversation. It wasn't a public scandal. There were no cameras, no speeches, and no official announcements. But according to growing reports, a private dispute reached the highest levels of the institution, and suddenly decisions that once seemed impossible were back on the table. The disagreement, insiders suggest, was not about one careless remark or one uncomfortable meeting. It was about authority, about who had the right to shape the royal household's future, about whether certain lines of protocol had been softened for too long in the name of peace. For years, Charles had tried to balance loyalty to Camilla with loyalty to the crown, but this private incident reportedly forced him into a corner where silence no longer looked like patience. It looked like weakness. Advisors were allegedly asked to begin internal reviews, not the kind that appear in public records with neat explanations, but the quiet palace kind. Discreet conversations, careful checks, old documents pulled back into view, responsibilities measured against tradition. Senior staff were said to be told to limit discussion, which only made the atmosphere more charged. When a royal household becomes too quiet, people start listening harder, and in that silence speculation grew. Had a boundary been crossed? Had influence moved beyond what senior figures considered acceptable? Had the monarchy reached a point where personal closeness was beginning to clash with institutional duty? Reports suggest that even those who had once defended Camilla's role began to ask whether intervention was becoming unavoidable. The pressure on Charles was no longer just emotional, it was constitutional in feeling, even if not in formal language. He was the husband, yes, but he was also the king. And a king cannot afford to look uncertain when the future of the monarchy is being debated behind his own doors. The more the palace refused to explain, the more the story darkened. Every unanswered question became another spark. Every whispered detail became another sign that something serious had happened. By the time the emergency order entered the conversation, the decision no longer seemed impossible. It seemed like the only move left for a monarch trapped between affection and duty. As pressure mounted behind the scenes, attention turned toward a question nobody expected to ask: could the king's final decision involve removing one of Camilla's most significant remaining royal distinctions? The meeting itself has already become the subject of endless speculation. Sources describe senior officials entering through private entrances. Documents were reportedly reviewed. Advisors moved in and out of secure offices. And when it ended, those present allegedly understood that a historic decision had been made. The atmosphere, according to palace whispers, was not loud or chaotic, but controlled in the most chilling way. This was the kind of meeting where every pause mattered, every word was measured, and every document carried the weight of royal consequence. Emergency consultations were reportedly held with advisors who understood both the personal sensitivity and the institutional danger of the moment. Legal voices were said to have been involved, not to create drama, but to make sure that whatever action came next could survive pressure, criticism, and confusion. At the center of the discussion was the delicate question of royal titles and privileges, the symbols that turn private family roles into public authority. For Charles, the choice was brutal. Camilla was not only his wife, she was the woman he had defended through decades of scandal, public judgment, and painful history. But the crown demanded something colder than affection. It demanded clarity. If the monarchy was entering a new era, then every title, every privilege, and every royal distinction had to serve the institution, not merely comfort the people closest to the throne. Reports suggest that senior family members were quietly briefed after the discussion, with just enough information to understand that the decision was no longer theoretical. Palace communications teams were allegedly placed on alert, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. Meanwhile, royal correspondents began picking up fragments, a phrase here, a sudden refusal there, a careful answer that sounded too rehearsed. And as rumors spread, the palace did what it often does when the truth is too explosive to release all at once. It locked itself behind restraint. But restraint did not calm the storm. It sharpened it. Because the more officials refused to speak, the more people believed something serious was moving toward implementation. The emergency order was no longer just a whispered possibility. It had become a machine in motion, carrying Charles toward a decision that could reshape Camilla's future and expose the deeper fracture inside the royal household. But signing an order is one thing, living with the consequences is another, and the fallout would soon reach far beyond the palace gates. Once word of the decision began circulating, reactions reportedly ranged from disbelief to relief. Some saw it as an act of necessity. Others viewed it as a stunning break from expectations. What nobody disputed was the magnitude of what had happened, and the message it appeared to send about the future of the monarchy. Inside the family, the response was said to be divided, not in loud rebellion but in the quiet, careful way royal tension often reveals itself. Some reportedly understood Charles's decision as a painful but necessary correction, a line drawn before uncertainty could spread any further. Others saw it as something more personal, more severe, almost impossible to separate from decades of history between Charles and Camilla. Palace staff, meanwhile, were left trying to manage a storm that had not yet been fully explained. Every silence became a signal. Every careful phrase from an aide sounded like an admission. Royal commentators began describing the move as unprecedented, not because titles have never changed, but because this one seemed to strike at the emotional center of Charles's reign. The public debate grew quickly, dividing viewers between those who believed the monarchy had finally chosen discipline and those who saw the decision as cold, even brutal. Yet beneath all the noise, one question kept returning: what would Camilla's role become now? Would she retreat into a quieter position, still present but no longer powerful in the same way? Or would the loss of this distinction mark the beginning of a larger reshaping of her place in royal history? As speculation deepened, attention naturally shifted toward William and Catherine, whose future suddenly looked even more central to the crown's survival. Their generation was no longer just waiting in the wings. They were becoming the answer to a crisis of trust. Legacy became the real battlefield. Charles, already under pressure from health concerns, public expectations, and internal disputes, now faced scrutiny not simply as a husband or father, but as the monarch responsible for deciding what must be protected and what must be left behind. The emergency order had done more than alter Camilla's standing. It had forced the entire country to look at the monarchy's next chapter and ask whether this was a moment of weakness or the first sign of a harder, cleaner future. And as the headlines multiplied, attention shifted to an even larger question: what kind of monarchy would emerge after such a dramatic change? For years, Camilla had weathered controversy, criticism, and intense public attention. But insiders suggest this moment felt different. This wasn't a newspaper headline or another wave of public debate. It was a decision reportedly originating from within the institution itself, development that carried an entirely different weight. Reports describe private disappointment, frustration, and a sense of deep personal shock among those closest to her, because this was not the kind of storm that could be dismissed as outside noise. For decades, Camilla had survived by waiting, enduring, and allowing time to soften public anger. She had moved from being one of the most criticized women in Britain to standing beside the king during the most important ceremonies of his reign. That journey had been long, painful, and carefully managed. But now, the very system that had once protected her appeared to be pulling back. Close associates were allegedly caught off guard, not only by the decision itself, but by the speed with which it moved through palace channels. Questions immediately began forming around her future responsibilities. Would her role become quieter? Would she still carry the same ceremonial weight? Would invitations, patronages, and internal privileges begin to shift away from her circle? Royal observers quickly began analyzing every possible next step, while the public response became sharply divided. Some felt sympathy, seeing the move as a harsh blow after years of service beside Charles. Others argued that the monarchy had finally accepted what critics had long believed, that public trust must come before personal loyalty. Historical comparisons soon followed, with commentators reaching back to earlier royal crises where titles, status, and acceptance became weapons in a much larger struggle. Through it all, The palace maintained strict silence, and that silence became its own message. No emotional defense, no warm clarification, no detailed explanation designed to calm speculation, just a cold refusal to feed the fire. And in that emptiness, uncertainty grew heavier. Camilla's position, once seen as settled, suddenly felt open to interpretation. Her past success now stood beside present vulnerability, creating a painful contrast between how far she had come and how quickly influence can be reduced when the crown decides to protect itself. Yet even as attention focused on Camilla, palace strategists were already looking ahead to something much larger than any one individual. At its core, this was never just about a title. It was about direction, about legacy, about deciding what the monarchy should represent in an era of unprecedented scrutiny. The emergency order may have targeted one position, but many believe its true purpose was to shape the institution's future. Once that became clear, the conversation inside royal circles reportedly began to change. Camilla's name still dominated the headlines, but behind the palace walls, the deeper concern was stability. The monarchy could survive disagreement. It had survived scandal, grief, divorce, exile, and public anger. But what it could not afford was confusion over who carried the future. That is why William and Catherine were suddenly viewed not only as heirs in waiting, but as the living answer to the uncertainty surrounding the crown. Their role represented continuity, discipline, and a return to the kind of traditional royal values that many advisors believed had been weakened by years of emotional conflict. Reports suggest that palace planners began looking beyond the immediate fallout, considering long-term reforms that would tighten responsibilities, clarify authority, and prevent private influence from becoming a public liability. Public trust became the central battlefield. Every decision now had to answer one brutal question: would this strengthen the monarchy, or make it look like a family protecting itself? That question gave the emergency order its deeper force. It signaled that the crown was preparing to defend its image, even if doing so created pain inside the family. Comparisons were quickly drawn with previous royal transitions, moments when the institution had been forced to choose between personal feeling and public duty. In those moments, history rarely remembered comfort. It remembered survival, and this moment, according to royal observers, carried that same unforgiving weight. Charles, William, Catherine, and the senior advisors around them were no longer simply reacting to a crisis. They were defining the next shape of royal power. The monarchy was entering a period where symbolism mattered more than ever, where titles were not decorative ornaments but signals of trust, purpose, and belonging. Camilla's reduced standing, if the reports proved accurate, was only one part of a larger reset. The bigger story was the crown drawing a hard boundary around its future, choosing order over softness, clarity over uncertainty, and legacy over personal protection. But before this chapter could close, one final revelation would emerge, one that explained why the order may have been issued with such extraordinary urgency. In the end, the emergency order was about more than authority, influence, or even royal titles. According to those following the story closely, it represented a final attempt to protect a vision of the monarchy that King Charles believed must endure beyond any individual. And that may be why the decision was made when it was. Reports suggest legacy concerns drove the final push, because Charles understood that every choice made now would be judged not only by today's headlines, but by history itself. The monarchy was standing at a critical crossroads, caught between old loyalties and future survival, between the pain of personal decisions and the cold duty of public responsibility. Camilla's place in royal history suddenly became one of the most debated questions around the crown. Some would remember her as the woman who endured years of criticism and still reached the center of royal life. Others would see this moment as proof that acceptance inside the monarchy can change when the institution feels threatened. But beyond Camilla, the bigger story pointed toward William and Catherine. Their future roles appeared stronger, sharper, and more necessary than ever, not because the past had disappeared, but because the palace needed a new center of gravity. Charles, facing pressure from every side, seemed determined to secure a long-term vision before uncertainty could weaken it. That is what made the emergency order feel so powerful. It was not only an ending, it was a warning. The palace was entering a new chapter, one filled with unanswered questions, careful silence, and the possibility of more changes still to come. The lasting impact remains unknown, but one thing became clear. The crown had chosen legacy over comfort, stability over sentiment, and the future over the fragile peace of the present. Because while titles can be granted, changed, or revoked, the real battle has always been about something far more enduring: the legacy that survives when the headlines finally fade. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.